Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're here because today's episode is a doozy. Today, I have 3 stories that nearly shattered everyone involved as they tried to rationalize what happened to them. Just wait until you hear what you're about to hear. So, if you're enjoying the channel, don't be invisible. Let us know you're out there and smash that subscribe button so we can always be together. Thanks. Now, let's get into the stories. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. At least, that's what my grandfather says. Of course, he also tells me I'm crazy that I wrote to your channel to tell you his story. But now that I've listened to your channel for a while, I feel like it's not just a crazy tall tale after all. But I guess you can judge that. Anyway, I live in Pennsylvania now, but my family is from down south. Deep south. My grandmother was a school teacher, and my grandfather was a cop. This was back in the day when they used prisoners as labor. So Grandpa did some time guarding chain gangs. Basically, prisoners were required to work to clean roadsides, road construction, dig ditches, that kind of thing. Grandpa was one of the sheriffs on guard duty, which meant that he got to stand around in the hot sun, shotgun on his shoulder, and monitor the men. He was a hard case, but he was never one of those guards who tolerated people getting hurt, no matter what side of the badge they were on. He made sure the men got water and rest when they needed it, but mostly, his job was to make sure nobody went wandering and that the work got done. This one story I want to tell you about happened back in the summer of '58. The chain gang was called out to dig out some drainage ditches along the highway outside of Guntersville. That's southeast of Huntsville. It's a nice town, right on the lake. Cleaning drainage ditches isn't easy, but it is necessary work. None of the convicts liked it. Hard labor in hot weather, mosquitoes the size of fishing boats, slogging in mucky water, digging out marsh plants that really didn't want to be dug out, cleaning trash. So you can imagine that there was plenty of complaining. To hear Grandpa tell the story, most of the men just stuck to complaining under their breath. Because some of the guards weren't too keen on chit-chat. Grandpa mostly kept himself to himself, and he did his patrol, walking up and down the convict line along where they worked, alongside the road. Grandpa had a dog with him, too. He was a German shepherd named Arizona, and he took his job about as seriously as Grandpa did. He was all business when they walked the line. So when the dog alerted, how their head goes up and their ears go straight, my grandfather took note of it. About a half a minute later, to hear my grandfather talk, one of the convicts started slapping at the water he was standing in. It was waist deep if it was an inch, thick with tall weeds and dark brown with all the mud they were kicking up. Couldn't see a thing, but he was yelling loud and clear that there was something in the water biting at him. Now, a drainage ditch isn't Lake Guntersville, but it's still water, so it's not a shock that something besides the men could be in it. My grandfather would have been more inclined to tell him just to pipe down, except for how Arizona was reacting. Grandpa called for the nearest corrections officer to help him, and they pulled the man up out of the water. Now, you can't pull someone on a chain gang very far without pulling the rest. But they did get him out far enough to see what the fuss was about. And sure enough, there were tears in his jumpsuit. When they rolled up the pant legs, they could see welts, dozens of them, as if something had bitten him. Well, Grandpa tells it like they assumed it was leeches, because that's a thing. But while they were figuring out what to do, another one of the convicts started jumping up and down, yelling. Now there's always a risk that the men on the chain gang were trying to put one over on the guards so that they could escape, but Grandpa looked over at his dog again, and Arizona was staring at the water in the ditch and whining. He gave the orders to pull all the men out of the ditch. That didn't sit right with a few of the other guards, but Grandpa was firm. It helped that the other dog on the site was acting the same way, staring at the water and whining, ears flat like he was scared. When they pulled the line up, the other prisoner who'd been shouting also had torn clothes. But there was something else there. The way Grandpa tells the story, his legs were covered in these little white, Grandpa said they looked like leeches, if leeches had arms and legs. I remember that I actually interrupted the story to ask if he was sure. I asked what they looked like, and he said in a very hushed voice, they were spindly little arms, like tiny skinny tree branches, but they ended in even tinier 3-fingered hands and feet, and those things were tight in that poor man's skin like the worst burr you have ever seen. The prisoner started yelling something awful as soon as he saw those things. I don't even know what to call them. He tried to run, and of course, since they were all chained together, this yanked the closest prisoners onto the ground with him. Half the chain gang was standing as far away as the chains would allow, and the other half, the ones closest to the lake side of the road, well, they were all down in the dirt and the weeds alongside the road. The guards tried to pull the creatures off his legs, but they were rubbery and hard to get a hold of. Or maybe it was because they were so slimy and disgusting that nobody really wanted to touch them. Even the dogs were whining and backing up, acting like scared puppies rather than working dogs. They could have just dragged the entire prisoner line into the bus and brought everyone back to the jail for the infirmary to take care of it. But these things were uncanny. There's just something about them. Grandpa said the sheriff tried to yank off the biggest leech, but the thing just clung tighter. Blood was running down the one con's leg as he wailed. A big, strong guy, too. One of the guards suggested cutting the head off like a lamprey. Did that work? I asked my grandfather. From the look on his face, I knew the answer. We cut it off at the neck, took the body clean off, but the head, it stayed. I could see it burrow deeper into the muscle. I don't mind telling you that I was feeling pretty grossed out by this story, but I was also invested, and I needed to see where it was going. So what happened? We burned them, my grandpap said. Apparently one of the other officers got the notion to grab the cigarette lighter out of the police cruiser so that they could try to burn them off. Grandpa told me that they shoved the hot metal against the back of the biggest leech's head to, well, you get the idea. I guess they needed to get it to let go. And it worked. The leech popped off with its mouth open, looking for all the world like it was screaming. It had a head like a lamprey, all teeth and blood, with tiny black eyes and no nose. Once it was loose, Grandpa grabbed it and twisted it off, threw it on the ground, and used his heavy boot on it. The sheriff told him to keep doing that while the rest of them unchained the prisoners who hadn't gotten anything on them to lead them back to the bus. Grandpa was stuck with the disgusting duty of removing whatever those things were, and that's when he got an idea. He ran back to the cruiser and pulled out a half-empty box of shotgun shells, dumped the shells in his pocket, and ran back to the prisoner. When they pulled off the next leech thing, he killed it but stuck the body in the box and ran that back to the car, where he locked it in the glove box. When he got back, the other officers were pulling off the last of the things. They'd just gotten to the last few when the dogs went high on alert. Grandpa trusted Arizona more than anything, so when his dog looked out at the lake beyond the drainage ditch, he looked too. Couldn't see anything, though, so he went back to burning off those critters. But Arizona was agitated, pacing at the edge of the ditch. So Grandpa looked again. There was something in the water, under the water. He could see the ripple of something moving, and it looked big, and it looked like it was heading their way fast. Grandpa shouted to get away from the ditch, and that was when the other dogs started whining, and then growling, and then going on full-on barking. The prisoners did what they could to scramble out of the range of the water, but even if they weren't chained on a line, their ankles were still chained together, and that limited how fast they could move. I point that out because the next thing Grandpa told me was how the water at the shoreline of the lake where it met the drainage ditch exploded. He said it just went up like God had turned on a fountain, but what came out was nothing the Lord ever made. At first he said he thought it was a gator. Not that they had them in that area, but it could have been one that came up the river from the bayous and stayed. But gators don't stand up, and this thing did. It had hide like a gator, scaled and green and slick, like armor, with a gator's underbelly too. But it had arms and shoulders like a man, if a man could be built like that. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the head, teeth like a lamprey and an open gash of a mouth, black eyes, no nose. And it screamed. My grandfather is a big, tough guy, even when he was old, and he still turned white when he told me how it sounded, like a shriek straight from hell. It moved before anybody else could do anything, and it went straight for the closest convict. It was the other man with bites on his legs, but none of the leech critters. Arizona and the other dog went for it, latching on its arm and its leg like they were trained to do. The prisoner was screaming because the thing had its claws in him. Grandpa said you could smell the blood over the stink of the ditch water. He holstered his shotgun and he fired dead center. He knew he hit it because the thing staggered and screamed again. Staggered, but didn't stop. It ripped that poor convict's leg clear to the bone. By this time, most of the other officers were calling off the dogs and unloading on it. It went back into the water, leaving a dying man and a bunch of prisoners, and cops who had no idea what had just happened. If you're wondering what happened after that, I can tell you what Grandpa said. They tried to save the mauled man, but he didn't make it. He died on the scene. The rest of the chain gang got brought back to the penitentiary. Now you have to remember that this was in the 50s, and there were two things on everyone's mind then. So when they got back to the jail, the sheriff called up the FBI to tell them they had a report. Either it was a red menace, or it was an alien. But either way, it wasn't a local jurisdiction thing. My grandpa used to joke that the feds were always a day late and $1 short on the best days. But pretty soon, men in suits were at the jail, taking testimony and grilling everyone. The body of the convict was confiscated. Evidence, they said. Of what? Well, they didn't say that. The witnesses were all ordered not to talk, and then the feds disappeared. A public service announcement went out later that night warning people to stay away from the lake. A rogue gator, a man-eater. I asked my grandpa why he was telling me this now if he had been warned not to talk about it, and he laughed. Well, who would believe me? And that's when I remembered that part of the story that he told me about having put those leech things in the car. Didn't he have that still? But my grandfather shook his head and told me that he'd had the same thought after the feds left. But when he got back to the cruiser, the ammo box was gone. No proof, no story. And the feds must have done something about whatever was in the lake, because only one fisherman went missing after that in a way that wasn't explainable. Crazy story from a confused old man, or the truth? I don't know what you or your listeners believe, but I'm happier thinking the first. All I know is I never go near that section of Lake Guntersville, just to be safe. My parents always warned me to stay away from the swamp on Big Marine. They said there was something in the water down there and that I wasn't to go anywhere near it. I always thought that they were talking about some sort of fungus or deadly algae, but you know how kids are. I figured that as long as I didn't touch the waters, I would be okay. Big Marine was a nature preserve just a few miles down the road from the house I grew up in Minnesota. Most of it was a wilderness area, but there were a few hiking trails around the main entrance. None of the trails went deep into the forest. I think the longest trail was maybe 3 miles. The swamp was situated alongside the road into the park. In fact, you could see it from the highway. I'll admit it looked rather creepy if you drove past it at night, but during the day, I never thought twice about it. The preserve didn't attract too many visitors, just a few locals who would use the area to walk their dogs. Most of the times I went there, it was completely empty. Not a single soul to be found. I spent most of my free time during the summer out there. I didn't have many friends and there wasn't much else to do. One of my favorite pastimes was catching baby snapping turtles. They were everywhere down there during the summer. When I couldn't find any turtles, I was looking for snakes, skinks, and salamanders. I could spend hours just looking for creatures in the grass. And that is exactly what I was doing on the day I had the incident in the swamp. I had lost track of time, not realizing the sun was already beginning to sink below the horizon. When I realized how late it was, I hurriedly grabbed my bicycle and started off down the park road. I almost even ran over a baby snapper that was trying to cross the road. I swerved around it, but then I stopped. There was never much traffic on the road, but I didn't want to leave the turtle there in case someone came by in a car. Baby snapping turtles are so dark they're almost black in color. Someone driving a car would never notice one in the road. I laid my bike on the side of the road and I picked up the tiny turtle. I was only going to put him on the other side of the road, but then I saw the swamp. It wasn't too far from the road I was on, and I thought, what better place for a turtle? The moment I looked over at the swamp, I immediately knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I couldn't think of any logical reason for my fear. So with the turtle in my hand, I walked off the road and into the tall grass towards the swamp. Something deep in the core of my being told me not to take one step further. But I looked down at the turtle that I was holding. I was maybe 20 yards away, if that. That distance would take a long time for a small turtle, but I could walk there and back in less than a minute. Plus, I could literally see the road. It wasn't like I was disappearing off into the forest where I could get lost. All of a sudden, every sound I had been hearing, the wind through the grass, the croaking frogs, and the chirping crickets, all stopped. I thought there was something wrong with me, like I'd lost my hearing, but then the silence was broken by this muffled scream. It sounded bubbly, like someone was screaming underwater. And then I saw ripples spreading from the center of the swamp. There was something down there, below the water. I was shaking so badly that I dropped the turtle. I didn't even look to see where it went. I was hyper-focused on the ripples in the swamp and what was beneath them. Slowly, I could see something coming to the surface. When it showed itself, the creature stood tall on two legs, like a human, but it wasn't a human. It looked like it had fur, but it was wet, so I couldn't tell for certain, but it looked like fur. It was either brown or black, and its face was dark, but it had a human-shaped head, but with a protruding snout. I don't have any idea what it was. I remember its eyes, though. They were a golden amber color, and they reflected off the light of the setting sun. The creature stared at me for a moment, and then it screamed. It was an ear-piercing scream. I saw a flash of teeth when it opened its mouth. I wasn't close enough to get a good look at them, but I could tell they were sharp, like those of a dog or a cat. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like jello. I wanted to turn and run, but couldn't. I stumbled backwards, and the creature showed its teeth. It never took its eyes off of me. Somehow I managed to make it to the road and got on my bike. I sped off down the road as fast as I could pedal. My legs were burning, but I barely even noticed. I was too afraid to look behind me, too. I was afraid it was chasing me, and for some reason I thought that if I didn't look, maybe it wasn't happening. I didn't even glance back at the swamp until I reached the end of the park road. But there it was, standing upright in the center of the swamp. It was still focused on me, but it hadn't moved. I turned onto the main road and I headed towards my house. As soon as I got to the road, all the normal nature sounds came back. I could hear the frogs again, the wind again, and then I looked back at the swamp and there was nothing there. No sign of the creature. That sort of freaked me out and made me happy at the same time, wondering where it was, but also happy to not be seeing it. I never figured out what it was, even after all these years. The only thing I have to say about it is, if you're ever out in the wilderness and it gets dead quiet, and I mean dead quiet like you can't hear anything, not even a breeze, run. Don't stand there looking around trying to figure out what's wrong. Just run.